And they ran away to Richmond, Virginia, which is where, the capital of the South was. And so while he was there, the Northern Army followed them, and they rested on top of this giant hill, and they felt pretty confident. They were like, hey, you know what? We just won. We can take our time with this. And Robert E. Lee was thinking, all right, how am I going to get my men out of this? Because the war could end. This had been 2 years of fighting, and the war could end today if the Northern armies attacked and beat the South. Now, the thing that Robert E. Lee did is, like I said, he was quick on his feet. So what he did is he got a group of men, a regiment of men, and he made them sneak outside of the town of Richmond. There's this giant wall, so the North couldn't see over the wall, but they could see behind the city and see this gate to the city. And so Robert E. Lee would send his men over this hill, and then they would hide behind this hill, and then they would march down into the city. So the North would be like, oh, Robert E. Lee has more men. That's okay, we still have more. But Robert E. Lee did this for 3 days or 4 days, I don't forget how many days in a row, and he kept switching these men's uniform every time they walked into the city. So all of a sudden, the North was going, oh no, Robert E. Lee's got this big army now. Even though it's the same amount of men that was already there, but their perspective, their view on the situation had changed because they were being tricked by Robert E. Lee, thinking that the army was now bigger. So the North stood back and said, okay, we're not going to attack right now because we're nervous you have a big army. And because of that, Robert E. Lee was actually able to sneak out of the city and sneak back to Virginia, and he was able to get more food, more men, more ammunition, more everything, and the war went on for 2 more years. Now, the reason I tell you that is because Robert E. Lee was smart. He was brilliant because he took advantage of the perspective, the Northern's view of the situation. Now, what I define perspective as is in the dictionary, it describes perspective as a particular attitude toward or a way of regarding something, a point of view. We all have different perspectives on different situations, and they're always changing. I'll give you a name out there that our perspective usually changes about, Justin Bieber. Most of you are like, haha, or I don't want to hear about Justin Bieber anymore. He's awful. But a couple years ago, we were all dancing to his music. We had Bieber fever, right? We were so pumped about Justin Bieber. Some of you are shaking your head. No, I'm not going to lie. I was into Justin Bieber. But that's okay. So a couple years ago, we were all like, yeah, Bieber fever. We're loving this. We love this. This is great. But then recently, he's gotten in trouble. He egged someone's house just for fun, got in trouble, was caught with drugs, and now our perspective whenever we hear Justin Bieber is no longer this innocent little guy who had great music, but now he's this guy who everybody goes, we don't want him. I actually saw this billboard on Facebook that said, whoever wins the Canada versus the U.S. match in the Olympics gets Justin Bieber back. So no one really likes Justin Bieber too much anymore. And it's an unfortunate thing. But what the point is that we change our perspective so often, don't we? We change our perspective about how we feel about people or how we feel about a certain situation or a certain product. And I've discovered over researching and through my years that there's 2 things that really influence our perspective. And that is people and our circumstances. People and our circumstances always influence what our perspective is going to be on a certain situation. The reason people is because, say you want to buy a computer and you're like, man, I'd love to buy an Apple product. But then you have those little people who whisper in their ear saying, no, Apple computers stink. And you keep hearing that. And so eventually your perspective changes from going, oh, I want an Apple computer to, no, I'll just stick with a PC. Right? I only say that because I have an Apple, right? But our perspective changes all the time because of people, right? We look at other people and we go, wow, I would really like to have a friendship with this person. And so you start talking with them. But then you hear other people talking about this person and saying not great things about them. So all of a sudden your perspective goes from, man, I really want to talk to this person, get to know them, to, no, they're sketchy. Everybody says they're sketchy, I'm going to stay away. You know? That's what people do with changing our perspective. Our circumstances also influence our perspective on life, right? There's a lot of times we'll be sitting there and we'll have a great job and we'll think it's great and we're like, man, this is great, I love this job. But then all of a sudden you get in an argument with your boss, you're in financial crisis, you can't afford to be at this job, and things aren't going great at home, and you're looking at your circumstances and you're going, man, my job sucks. My job stinks. I don't like this job anymore. And it's the same thing with relationships as well, with a significant other, your husband, your wife, your fiance, your boyfriend, your girlfriend. It doesn't really matter. If you have a couple arguments with them, you have kids cause problems, but they're great, right? But they cause problems, and they cause tensions sometimes. And so what you thought this marriage was, what you thought was great at first, all of a sudden you're dreading it. You're going, man, my circumstances are awful. I don't like this relationship anymore. Your perspective is always changed by people and your circumstances. And there's a great example of this in the Bible found in Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. It's up on the thing. We're high tech here, so it's great. So if you want to read together with me, that'd be great. We can read the Word of God. It says, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, and birds and animals and reptiles." So Romans is written by Paul, one of the great apostles, one of the great, he did a lot of great stuff for God. And he was ministering to the Romans. And he had this situation here in Romans, is people knew and heard about who God was, and their perspective at first was probably they were open-minded to it. They were like, great, this is awesome. But then the people around them, which was the Romans who worshipped other gods and did other things, started influencing them. And their circumstances were, hey, in Rome, if you're a Christian, you could be killed, right? Or you could be persecuted or made fun of. So they were like, well, we're not going to do that. So their perspective changed from, being open to the idea of God to all of a sudden they started worshiping other things and started worshiping reptiles and God's creation, right? And so I think about that, and I think about it in my own life, and you guys as well probably think about this too. Do people and our circumstances influence our perspective of God? It's a tough question. It's not really a fun question to ask. But it's the thing that I want to talk about that's really conflicting. It's the issue. It's the problem that we have is a lot of the times, yes, without even knowing it, people and our circumstances do influence our perspective on God. People, for example, influence us every day about God. We look at our relationships with our fathers, right? Or our people who we look up to, right? I say fathers because when we say God is our father, we tend to relate a father to the only thing that we know as a father, which is our earthly father, right? And a lot of the times, let's just say a couple examples here. Let's just say you had a father who was just really into nagging at you, right? You had a father who you would do something and he would be like, oh yeah, that's pretty good, but you got to do it better. And, oh, hey, you need to do this, you need to do that, don't do this, don't do that, all that stuff, right? And it just really wasn't that much fun, right? And so your perspective on God is kind of like, wow, God, I really feel like God just kind of nags at me, right? I really feel like he doesn't really understand where I'm going. He doesn't really love me unless I perform well. And it's if you had a father, let's just say, who was like, hey, you have to do good things for me to show my affection to you. You had to perform well. You had to get good grades. And yes, it's good to get good grades. But if that was the only way, like let's say you got a C and your dad was disappointed and didn't show affection to you, you thought the same thing maybe about God. You were like, well, God only loves me. God only cares about me when I perform well. Or if you had a father who abused you, sometimes we go, well, God doesn't love me. God doesn't love me whatsoever. He's Just doesn't. And if you didn't have a father figure whatsoever, sometimes you were just lost on who God was. Or let's say, I know for some of my family members, their reason for not believing in God and having an awful perspective of God was because they had grown up in the church and they had this perspective of these guys and they knew what God was supposed to be like, but they saw these men or women who kept saying that they were godly Christians, but then they were hypocrites. They would be out, drinking or getting into things like pornography that they shouldn't have been getting into. Their marriages were a mess. And so some of my family members, not immediate, but some of my family members, they didn't accept God because people had changed their perspective because of how they acted, right? And our circumstances, like I said, also change our attitude, our perspective of God, right? We get into those financial issues, we get into those, marriage issues, we get into friendships, we get into just different ideas, and we go, all right, God, I'm asking for some help here, and you're not really helping me out. Do you not love me? So all of a sudden, your perspective, which you thought was great, all of a sudden turns to this anger that you have towards God. And that's the issue, like I said, is our perspective is influenced by people and our circumstances towards God. And we don't mean to, but it happens sometimes without us even knowing it, just because of relationships we've had and circumstances that we've been in. So, if that's the wrong way, if we're not supposed to have God, or if we're not supposed to perceive God because of people and our circumstances, what are we supposed to do? Well, I'll tell you what you're supposed to do. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to allow God to be the one that helps you perceive God the way He's supposed to be God, right? I have it written down that, to perceive God well, you have to have God tell you how to perceive Him. Perspective, right? God influences your perspective on Him. If you have other people doing it, it's going to end up a mess, right? So when we have God as our person who influences our perspective, it's great. But when we have other people and we have our circumstances influencing us, it's kind of like in the circus, when they get baby elephants, what they do is they tie an elephant to this baby elephant to a big, huge, unmovable post, right? And the elephant will pull on it, try to get away from it, and it will yank and it will try to get its freedom, right? But here's the problem, is it can't. It's too big. It's huge. So as the elephant gets bigger and larger, you would think, oh man, they'll just put another big post there so the elephant can't get out. No. They actually used the same post that they used as a baby because the elephant perceives, hey, I couldn't move this when I was a kid. I'm not going to be able to move this as an adult. So they don't even try. Now it sounds cruel, but it works. But that's also how we are when people are influencing our perspective on God. We're enslaved to the post. The post takes us away from freedom. A freedom that we could have if we had God leading our perspective. Now, the question that most people would ask is, well, then how do we change ourselves from being chained to this post, being enslaved to people and our circumstances? People ask, well, how do we change that and allow God to be the person that influences our perspective? And the way that you do that is by looking in the Bible. Because in the Bible, you have all these great examples of people who had great perspectives of God, where God was the person who influenced their perspective. I think of Noah. Noah was called to build a giant ark, right? And in that time, no one had ever heard of rain. Everybody was kind of like, what's rain? I don't understand what rain is. Noah, you're nuts, right? So they were kind of, people would come and they would jeer at him. They would make fun of him, be like, Noah, you're crazy. Stop doing what you're doing. But it says in Genesis, Noah knew God. Noah knew who God was, and because he knew who God was, he was able to boldly go forth and build this ark, even though it took him 100 years. And even though it was crazy and it sounded nuts, he still built it. He still built it because he knew who God was. And because he knew who God was, he was not influenced by people or circumstances, and he was able to build this ark. I think of Moses as well. Moses is one of my favorite people in the Bible because Moses was a prince, and then he was a shepherd, which was nothing, and then he was pretty huge, leading millions of people, right? And all of a sudden, he's out there, and he sees this big, glowing fire bush that wasn't on fire. Don't ask me. I don't know how to explain it. But he was out there, and God said, you're going to lead these people. And yes, he argued with them and said, God, I'm not worthy of doing this. But God was like, no, I'm sending you. And Moses would have communication. He had a relationship with God. And because he knew who God was, he was able to go into Egypt and ask and get the freedom of the Egyptians, or the Israelites, not the Egyptians. But the Egyptians would make fun of him. They would laugh at him. They'd be like, what are you doing? You're nuts. We're not letting these people free. And then even the Israelites were like, we're not going to get free. Are you kidding me? So he had all these people who were trying to influence his perspective of God and the situation. He had all these different circumstances. But you know what he did? He still boldly went out there and he still got them free. God used him, right? And then when they were out in the desert, he's sitting there going, all of a sudden, he's leading sheep to millions of people. Of course, he has no idea how to lead millions of people. And most of us would run away from that. Our perspective would be like, God, you're nuts. I'm leaving this situation. But because Moses knew God, he was able to still lead these millions of people, and he was still able to get them to the promised land eventually. These two men are just an example of what it's like to have a great perspective that's influenced by God. And the way that they were able to have this great perspective of God, a perspective that was influenced by God, was because they had a relationship with Him. They communicated. They knew who God was. And how do we relate that to ourselves these days? Because we go, well, Joe, they were able to talk to God and God would talk to them back. God doesn't really do that with us these days. No, He does. He does. He really does. And the problem that we have, and the problem that a lot of Christians have, and even non-Christians, is because we don't go for it. We sit there sometimes and we go, all right, God, just wait to have this relationship with you. And we just stand there waiting. And God's like, no, you got to come. You got to come to me. You got to come to get to know me. And when you come and you pursue me with all your might, I am going to reveal myself to you. If you read the Bible, you look at the Bible and you go, okay, I've read this 1,000 times and it still doesn't reveal to me what's going on. You're looking at it with the wrong perspective. Ooh, you know? You're looking at it with the wrong perspective, and you're letting people influence you, and you're allowing your circumstances to influence you. What you really need to ask is, when you're reading the Bible, ask God, hey, show me something in here. Reveal yourself to me. This is the living Word of God. Of course He's going to reveal Himself to you if you ask Him to. So get in the Word. I know it's typical, and we always say, oh, read your Bible, pray every day. Well, and we go, well, I'm looking for something deeper. No. That is deep. That's simple. That's great. Do it. And you'll find that a lot of the times God will reveal yourself to you. Also, Moses and Noah both communicated with God, right? How do you have a relationship with somebody? Wives and husbands, girlfriends, fiancés, boyfriends, just friendships. How do you communicate with each other? You talk, right? You talk to one another. Our problem is we go, all right, God, I'll talk to you in the morning, but I'll talk to you tomorrow morning and the morning after, but I'm not going to talk to you throughout the rest of the day. Wow. Are we going to do that to our wives? Are we going to do that to our husbands? No, they're going to get mad, right? Right? I've seen it. They do. They get angry with each other. If there's a lack of communication, something's wrong. It's the same thing with God. God's not that He gets angry at you, but He's looking for you to talk to Him. He wants you to communicate with Him. He wants you to go, hey, God, I really need your help today. I'm dealing with this guy who's really irritating. Reveal yourself, through me, to me, with talking to this guy. Reveal yourself to me through the interactions that I have throughout the day. right? You ask God for these things, and God will give it to you, right? He will reveal himself to you if you're honest and you want to see him, right? And once you actually know God, and once you finally start to realize, wow, God, you're pretty awesome, you're the Almighty, all of a sudden when people try to change your perspective, like Robert E. Lee tried, it's easier to ignore. Because you're like, I know who God is. You're lying, Who are you? Same with circumstances. You're able to look at your circumstances, and instead of dreading them and going, man, it's going to suck today, blah, 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 blah. No, you're able to look at it and go, you know what? Yes, it's going to stink, but I am going to have a great day because God's going to reveal himself to me. And through me, God will be able to reveal himself to others. When you know God, God reveals himself through you as well. When you have a perspective that is influenced by God, God reveals himself through you. Know who God is, which is pretty awesome, I would say. I would like that. I strive for that. And I'm sure we all strive for that. But if we struggle with it, if we have people who do influence us, if we do have our circumstances that do influence our perception, our perspective of God, then we need to do something about it. And the only way that we're going to be able to do something about it is if we go to God. If we have a relationship with him, like I just explained. It takes action. It takes movement. So this week, what I would like to be able to do, and I would like that John would come up and play That Well song, because it just fits well. What I would like for you to be able to do is to be able to take this, view, like if you're sitting there and you're struggling with a perspective of God, if you're struggling with your perspective being influenced by others or by people or by circumstances, and you need to do something about it, just confess to him that you've been wrong. Just go to him and say, God, I'm sorry. I am really sorry that I have been lost, that my perspective has been changed. Because when your perspective is from God, God can do crazy things through you. Look at Noah. Look at Moses. Look at anybody in the Bible who knew who God was. They were able to do crazy good things because God was able to use them. And so go home this week. And my favorite book in the Bible is John. And I was thinking about this and praying about it as I was coming up. I was like, I got to give them something to go, help them out with this. Help them to remember this, And so I was sitting there, and I was like, what's helped me in my past? What's helped me to really get to know God? What's helped me to get past being influenced by others and by my circumstances? It's by reading the Word, yes. And what book really, really helped me was the book of John. Because in all honesty, I think the book of John shows who Christ is, shows who God is the most, I think. And when I ask God, change my perspective. Change my heart. Help me to get away from the influences of others. Help me to get away from the circumstances of my life and show me who you really are. That book changed. All of a sudden, it was like I was reading a whole new book. I've been through Christian high school and I've been through college. I've read the book of John hundreds of times. But when I asked him to reveal himself personally through this and show me who he was, all of a sudden, that book became new to me. All of a sudden, I was realizing that God was completely different than what my view of him was. Because for years, it was hard for me to accept his love. For me, it was hard to just embrace that he actually loved me because of my faults. But when I read it and I got a different perspective, God revealing himself to me, my whole life changed. And the cool thing about it is your life can change as well. If you're sitting there and you're like, man, I need to get a different perspective of God, do it. Just go home this week, ask God before you open it up, and just go, God, reveal yourself to me through these pages. Reveal yourself to me through your living word, and let me see who you are.